I wanted to explain something about a very short video I recently posted that I filmed a while back. It was called Why Freedom Means and Includes Freedom from Consequences. I was explaining that if you use your freedom of speech, if you act within the law, and you use your liberty and don't take other people's liberty, then the consequences of what you do, then like there shouldn't be any bad consequences. Not legally, not otherwise. Besides, if you do something that other people think is distasteful that doesn't take away their rights or their freedom, they can boycott you, not stop talking to you, ostracize you, criticize you. If it's true, they can say accurate things about you that make you look bad as long as they don't defame you. I wouldn't want to take away anyone's right to sue another person for defaming them. See, here's the thing. There are radical libertarians and agorists and like private law advocates, libertarians who read Robert P. Murphy and people like Roderick T. Long who are involved in the same ideas. Like there could be a private court system without the state. And just because it is a private court system doesn't mean that it would be a profit motive. You see, there is such a thing as a part of the private sector that is not for profit. It's called the not for profit private sector. See, private sector means, loosely, it means the sector that's outside of the state. You see, the problem is that people associate the public sector with the state and they think everything else is the private sector and they assume that all private sector things must be for profit and anti-state. But there's lots of things that are outside the state. There's not-for-profits, there's cooperatives, there's community and consumer-oriented organizations, there's social purpose enterprises, there's all kinds of things, there's charities, there's religious groups, there's clubs, there's all kinds of ways and firms, different types of firms that aren't strictly, oh, either the government, federal, public, monopolistic government, the state, or private big corporations that are funded by, again, the government. Like, there are firms that exist that are not part of the state. Like, people who are working unlicensed are not part of the state. Everyone who's unemployed are mostly not very not very closely associated with the state. Here's the thing. When I'm talking about freedom from consequences, number one, I'm not saying you can say things that incite a mob to violence because I'm not going to excuse the the legalization of free speech that literally calls for violence. Free speech that maybe kind of leads to violence, that's called supposedly stochastic terrorism. I don't want to call that real terrorism. But the thing I want to bring your attention to is political speech that's in the favor of statist parties like the Democrats and Republicans, and also like fascist parties. Those are like that speech is calling for violence, is calling for legitimized political violence, which is how the state operates. The state uses legitimized violence to promote its goals, allegedly of securing civil order and peace, but it's actually for just helping the police and the lawyers and the military and the judges all reign supreme over the rest of us, and they get away with committing all the crimes they want if that's their choice. So when you're speaking in favor of statist parties, you are excusing political violence. And that's the thing that's not being discussed in this whole free speech discussion. It's like people are like, "Oh, can your business fire you for speaking, in a way that is not in line with their political views?" It's like 90% of you believe that it's okay to put people in rape cages for committing small crimes like doing drugs and working unlicensed and not paying taxes and prostitution, like things that are on the line of like, okay, those things are illegal. Why are there like they're not necessarily wrong. Like there's a societal feeling that most of those things are not really wrong, and that if you believe those things, you're a libertarian. Like 50 years ago, contraception was banned, and they were drafting people. So there was more of an overlap between the libertarian left and the libertarian right as to, oh, they're taking away our rights socially and economically. So Anyone who's not calling for the abolition of the state and its legitimization of violence is excusing, that they are calling for violent speech. So if you're going to be consistent and say, you know, I'm not saying that a person is conscious that they're calling for violence, but really, what are Democrats and Republicans but people that basically want to kill each other? I mean, there is about 50% overlap. If you look at the congressional studies, there's about a 50% overlap on average between Democrats and Republicans in terms of how much they agree with each other and pass legislation. Like even the most far apart congressman, it's like only 82% of a difference. I don't know if that's just in Congress or judging from the whole political spectrum, but yeah, there's plenty of overlap between Democrats and Republicans, but like they would put each other in cage. They would certainly put each other's leaders in cages if they had the ability to. Like Trump threatened to put Hillary Clinton in prison. He didn't do it, so you gotta question, you know, where those loyalties are. But it's possible that they could want to put some of each other's parties' leaders in prison. It's possible that I mean, Biden has about 2 million people, 3 million people in prison right now as a result of legislation he wrote 28 years ago, the 94 crime bill. And so I'm sitting here like libertarian, Green Party, socialist, communist, anarchist should work together. Third parties, like, we need to make it legal in 40 more states for third parties to work together because there's 40 states or so that ban like if you want to collect signatures for libertarians and then be like, I want to, this, well, you're not a libertarian. Well, this Green Party person is also running. Like you can only legally do that as a signature collector in about 10 states right now. So um, I'll be reporting on that more in the future, and that'll help third parties work together more if they want to. Because we need third parties and decentralization and parties that strongly believe in nonviolence to overcome the state. And it's not just the state we have to get rid of, it's all violence. So, but to have a state that legitimizes violence, that's the biggest obstacle to creating a world without violence. And I don't want to promote so called violent speech, but I also don't think people should lose their jobs for being Democrats and Republicans. I just think they should be socially ostracized to the point where they're embarrassed to realize that they believe in a monopolized, centralized federal state and a very unclear separation of powers between the national and state governments, and also a very unclear delineation between what is public and what is private. And that goes to what I said before. Like, you could have limits on corporations all you want, but you want to limit corporations' right to censor people's speech. Well, what if you like how far would you go? What about a cooperative corporation? Like there's this thing called the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain. It's a cooperative corporation. It's a corporation that tries to be nonprofit, but in some parts of it's a company that's active in multiple countries now. So in some areas they are more for profit, and in some areas they're less for profit. So, but they try to balance it. They try to be for steady, reasonable profit and sustainable development, and eschew the ethics of both a corporation and cooperative at the same time. Are you going to take away their right to censor people if some of their workers decide to join Nazi and fascist parties and speak in favor of like genociding some people or something? Like, how far do you want to go? Like, there are provocateurs out there. There are people who want to test the limits of free speech by appearing to, they're just on the edge of like calling for a mob to riot, like people who out transgender people, like Milo Yiannopoulos did once. So there are people who do want their speech to become violence and they don't want to call for it directly. Like, if you watch like Hitler speeches, the guy's basically making jokes. Like it sounds like a Trump rally, and people are like he's indirectly calling for violence. You know, there are ways to speak freely, so-called, like within the realm of acceptable and legal language, but not directly call for violence, or at least not appear to. And it's like, what do you do about that? And like, do you start banning Mein Kampf and start burning literature? Like, do you want people to not know how evil people became evil so that they can avoid taking that same path? How far do you go? Do you force teachers and scientists or whatever who are presenting theoretical ideas to like give some kind of caveat and give all these trigger warnings and weigh in on what students are about to see even before they see it? That's preemption of speech. Like, that's prior restraint. That's not legal. That's a violation of the First Amendment. So it's not just when the government does it. You see, I understand the criticism of libertarians saying that they support corporations which can survive without the state. Chomsky said that. That's true. But there are libertarians, such as myself and anarchists, who understand that corporations that accept, subsidies from the state, it makes sense to regulate them. It would make more sense to regulate them, at least if it's a corporation getting subsidies from the state, it would make more sense to regulate them than it would to regulate a small business that is operating without the state and not using money and not using the roads or paying for the creation of its own roads so that the taxpayers don't have to, a business that doesn't suck resources with the state's help. It wouldn't make as much sense to regulate and tax that business heavily or inappropriately as it would to large corporations that are active in multiple states and employing thousands of people. See, this is why you have to understand the Supreme Court case, Heart of Atlanta Motel versus, I think, is U.S. versus Heart of Atlanta Motel, the 1964 discrimination case that involved discrimination and interstate commerce. So the federal government has a right to make sure that commercial laws are more or less uniform across states to allow the free passage of goods and resources and labor and capital across state lines, like to have, like, because you wouldn't want interstate tariffs. The federal government's purpose, part of its purpose, is to prevent and criminalize interstate tariffs. That would just be blatant interstate competition, like states competing against each other, against other states, as if they were corporations, which they are for financial and legal purposes. You see, it's not just part of that, it's not just a whim of some Supreme Court justice in a railroad case in the 1850s who wrote in the margins that corporations have personhood. It's actually real. Corporations do legally have rights. You're allowed to not like that, but it's true and you have to accept it. It's okay to want to change it, but for financial purposes, the federal government for sure is a corporation. And some of the state governments on the East Coast were started as land corporations. Like the states are literally corporations. And like you have to accept that. It's okay to want to change it, but you can't ignore it. You can't refuse to accept it. Just because corporations have personhood doesn't mean you have to like it. So I don't think corporations should have personhood, especially not ones that take subsidies from the state and use the state's resources and take resources that the taxpayers are paying for. You know why? Because then that makes it impossible for those taxpayers to avoid buying from that company or working for that company or working near that company or getting polluted by that company's emissions or getting harmed by that company in some way. It's like, yeah, they have an opportunity to work from them and buy from them if what they're doing is ethical, if their products are safe. But it's like, see, we wouldn't need government intervention to make sure the products are safe and healthy if we would just give people the freedom to not buy from those companies. And we don't have the right to boycott companies right now because of the cycle of taxation of my money to subsidize companies that are unethical that I disagree with and don't want to buy from or work for, and I'm forced to bail them out. This is big companies and small companies now. because during the coronavirus, they gave companies PPP loans to continue their business, and then they just forgave the loans. And it's like, that's my money. And then they give me like $1,200 as a like to compensate me. Oh, thanks. So it's just ridiculous. And then there's people in the Libertarian Party who argue that the fact that taxpayers are getting subsidized by the state makes them what, public property, or what, that like they're at least subject to regulation. I would see that, but no, the amount the taxpayers are getting in proportion to how much is being taken from them is just it's it's not enough to justify taking from taxpayers just so you can justify, corporations getting a little subsidies from government and not having to pay as much taxation and regulation. I'm talking about the capitalists, strongly capitalist libertarians who are even okay with, well, some form of corporations aren't created by the state. It's like, yeah, that's true, but we need to have more corporations that are cooperative and, you know, in favor of reasonable, sustainable profit instead of short-term gains and reckless behavior at taxpayer expense. We need more companies that don't rely on the government, that are trying to do big things with their big money, but for the little people and for the good of the nonprofits and people who want to work in concert with other people without calling it anything, without taxing it, without getting taxation and the government involved. Like mutual benefit corporations, mutual benefit associations, mutual aid societies, and potentially mutual benefit corporations. Think about this: a nonprofit firm that people just donate to and can take from freely, that uses all money donated to do bulk purchasing. You save money by buying in bulk. Seems counterintuitive, but the more you buy, like if you go to a Costco or a Winco, you can save money by buying in bulk. That's what like outlet stores are for. Like there are solutions to our economic problems that don't involve the state. And when companies are operating with an explicit social purpose, it's arguably a reason, in my mind at least, to not tax them as heavily, not regulate them as much, because they're doing something that helps people. You don't need to tax them. They're already fulfilling a social purpose. The purpose of taxation, the government says, is to fulfill a social purpose, to give back something to society. Well, what if the company already has an explicit social purpose in its charter? We should take away the charters potentially, or at least not renew them in the future, not renew the charters of companies that don't have a explicit social purpose and that leech money from the taxpayers. Because, you know, it's not just, and I'm not just saying like help the taxpayers in the interest of me keeping my money and in the interest of rich people keeping my money. I'm doing in the interest of everyone keeping their money. Everyone who doesn't get most of their money from other taxpayers. If you work and you pay for your own needs, then you should decide. It's like give a person their own tax money back, and then they'll have more money to spend for charity for sure. Yeah, they'll have more money to spend on themselves, and they'll put some of that in the bank. But the bank can loan out that money. Like people can do whatever they want with that money. Like that was what Andrew Yang's idea was about, as little money as it was, and they ended up doing it. They sent people checks, and like I don't think they did that for about 20 years. I think during the end of the Clinton administration, they sent some checks out, and maybe again at the beginning of George W. Bush. But it wasn't consistent checks, obviously, but they did it on a small scale, and that's the point. Send people their own money back. Give us our money back. Hey, government, your services suck. We want our money back. I want my right to demand my money back. I want my right to negotiate at the supermarket back and get rid of these UPC codes. Let's get some stores without all these UPC codes on them so I can negotiate the price at the counter if I want to. Obviously, it'd be really inconvenient to have that everywhere, but some stores should allow it. Some communities should allow it. So there's ways to fulfill people's wants in terms of economics and what they want in terms of socializing. And we don't need to have it all mixed together because there's clearly people who want to keep wearing masks and people who don't. And there should be areas where each of them can be free to do that. Like obviously hospitals, I mean, I would like it if only hospitals and nursing homes required masks. Like, here's the thing, what about the need for fresh air and sunshine? I don't need to get into that because I'll get censored by YouTube, but we have to like we have to protect people's rights to go to work if they want to. You know, it should be as easy to avoid a strike as it should to go on strike. It should be as easy to leave your union as it is to start a new union. I want a fair society that's equal because everyone's free. Everyone would be equally free by being totally free. And we would have equal protection under the law because the law would protect our freedom and our legitimately acquired property. Property we didn't steal from other people through fraud or burglary, and property we didn't legally steal from people through the process of taxation and subsidization. And in a way, government sending us our own money back. It's like, oh, thanks for sending me my own money back after you loaned it out to war criminals and rapists and sent it back to me. Thanks. My money's like got blood on it. Thanks. This is really nice. Thanks, government. So I want my money back. I want my right to boycott back. I want my right to strike back. And until I have that, we don't have a free economy. See, the ability to have a free economy lies in everyone's equal right to easily start a business without being excessively regulated and taxed. Everyone should have some, I'd like it, unless people don't want it, I'd like people to have a bit of property in their backyard with some resources that come from the earth that they can refine, with a machine. If they have, I like everyone to have some farm equipment, everyone who needs it, and they could plow a field and get that resource from the earth and sell it and have a little business on their house, like by their house or in their house if they need to. Like there's plenty of places where zoning laws just don't allow you to work in the same place that you live. And what do we have now? Pandemic, people staying home, trying to work from their computer while they're in their house. You have to let people be free to make money from their house. That's where they live. It's expensive to leave your house. It's expensive to drive places and get gas and maintain a car, get car insurance, and licenses and all that, all the fees and the tolls. So we need freedom. We need economic freedom. We need social freedom, and we need to stop pretending that the private and the public sectors are the only things that exist. There are clubs, there are commons, there's ways to do the public sector in a statist way, and there's ways to do the public sector in a way that more resembles a commons. And that's where communities and communism and libertarian communism and, Murray Bookchin thought come in. Decentralized communities, voluntary communities, intentional communities, communities that are built when 50 people or whatever come together. Is like, we're going to build a bunch of houses here. We're going to make a small town and it'll grow. And cities start as unincorporated communities. And we could have a bunch of unincorporated communities. You know why? Because every incorporated community has to have a post office. Having a post office in every single zip code in America is a huge waste of resources, you could say. It's closed about half of the time, right? No, 40 hours out of 168, it's closed 75% of the time. Yeah, the post office could house people. So you don't need to have a town turn into an incorporated community because then that town becomes a corporation. When it becomes incorporated, it becomes part of the federal corporation. And now anyone using federal services, of which there are many, is now subject to federal regulations. I say forget about that. We need to turn back to unincorporation and dissociation from the federal government and decentralization.